I Hate Politics is a podcast about a human activity we love to hate. I am Sunil Dasgupta. The 445th session of the Maryland General Assembly, which ended April 10th, was billed to be the cannabis session. Based on a referendum that was supported overwhelmingly by Maryland voters in 2022, the body had to build a new framework for growing, processing, and selling recreational marijuana in the state before July 2023. What came of it? I spoke with Delegate David Moon from Legislative District 20, which covers Tacoma Park to Hillendale in Montgomery County, about what laws were passed and what other issues remain. Moon is the vice chair of the House Judiciary Committee and a longtime advocate for legalized marijuana.
All of the drinks were cool, and all of the guests were fools. Watch them shaking heads at the fool party. All of the sandwiches served for the special occasion observed, passed on from bare hand to hand at the fool party.
I Hate Politics is a podcast about our neighborhoods, workplaces, schools and streets, and our local governments as they function in diverse and democratic societies. This means our politics are messy, dirty, sometimes corrupt, with often self-serving politicians. But no matter how much we hate politics, we are never exempt from it, even when we refuse to participate. In fact, the purpose of politics is to keep society moving precisely when we don't agree with each other, like now. Music for this episode comes from Cat's Can, a band of three friends who have known each other since kindergarten in Vienna, Northern Virginia. Paul Chaparis on bass and vocals, Mason Shelby on keyboards and vocals, and Kevin Kingsley on guitars. Their art pop style of music and satirical lyrics can be found on all good streaming sites.
The bath water was tainted. All of the fools have now fainted. Wash your shaking hands, they were foolhardy.
In the news this week, I had, in an earlier episode, brought up the appointment of former Montgomery County Council member Craig Rice for a new job as a special projects manager in the office of the county executive. So I should also mention that Rice has now withdrawn from that position, citing insinuation on social media that he got the job because of his friendship with County Executive Mark Elrich. Elrich had created the position specially for Rice, and it would be interesting to see if anyone else will fill that position. 'Tis the season for budgets and mulch sales. The Maryland General Assembly passed the first budget of the Westmore governorship, and across the region, local budget debates are in full swing. In Washington, D.C., Mayor Bowser initially cut funding for some schools as enrollment dipped, though she did increase the per-pupil funding. These schools were also located in the less wealthy and black majority parts of the city, and leave the impression that public education is not a viable proposition in poorer zip codes. Similarly, in Montgomery County, the countywide PTA body, called Montgomery County Council of PTAs, MCCPTA, has weighed in on behalf of a tax bill to increase recordation tax proposed by council members Will Joando and Kristen Mink. MCC-PTA says that the recordation tax increase is necessary to meet the shortfall in the capital budget demands for schools, especially in the first 3 years of the 6-year capital budget cycle the county follows. But the Greater Capital Area Association of Realtors is opposing the tax increase since it will affect the closing costs on home sales. The recordation tax argument is part of a larger tax increase debate. County Executive Mark Elrich has proposed a 10% hike in property taxes, which has also arrayed supporters and opponents. How the politics of tax hikes play out, the shift in public finances of the state and the county is really been striking if you compare with last year. Last year, 2022, both county and state were looking at windfall revenues, both in tax collections and federal funding. Many legislators and council members at that time cautioned about a coming downturn. But it wasn't expected for a few years. The revised revenue estimates from the Comptroller's Office in 2023 has created a sense of shortfall all around. Spring is also the season for mulch sales. Mulch is shredded tree lumber that homeowners and gardeners add to flower and vegetable beds and to tree bases to keep them weed-free and looking good. In the United States, every spring, we sell millions and millions of bags of mulch, which come in plastic bags of 2 or 3 cubic feet. Several decades ago, someone figured out that mulching was a seasonal activity that required a lot of manual labor, and from that realization was born the high school mulch sale fundraiser. The lumber company takes its wasted ends and bad lumber and shreds them and puts them in bags. They then deliver the bags to a high school where booster clubs and PTAs resell the bags in the community and make a small profit. They can also charge for delivery and spreading fees in people's homes. This work is done together by high school students and their families. Typically, athletic teams are assigned to this labor and get the proceeds, which they can then use for uniforms or equipment or travel. Numbers vary greatly, but the mulch sale I organize on behalf of the Booster Club in the school my kids go to, we ended up selling 11,500 bags last year. And after paying for all expenses, we were able to raise $18,000 for the students. That makes it the biggest single fundraiser for the school. And the sale really is also a great opportunity for the community to come together for a common purpose in early spring after having spent winter indoors. What leaves me with a gnawing feeling, however, is that we also produce 11,500 plastic bags. Last year, I estimated that high school fundraisers potentially produced 21 million plastic bags in an effort to raise money for the school and our students. There are, of course, great benefits to coming together as a community. Perhaps even more important than the money that we raise. But is the plastic pollution worth it? Can we do better? One reason I have taken on the organizing of the mulch sale is to see if I can change the model of the fundraiser to be plastic free. This is not easy. The plastic bags allow the mulch to be transported, loaded and unloaded by students, and the labor the students put in gets compensated. There is no way to deal with bulk mulch. to do bulk mulch, we would have to abandon the barnstorming approach that we take for the mulch sale day and divide up that work into small parts. One answer might be to have professional delivery, but expand the mulch spreading service. But the barnstorming party is half the fun of participation. If we have a tedious schedule of mulch delivery and spreading, would it have the same appeal? Should those of us who dislike plastic pollution simply accept that this cannot be done? If you are listening and have ideas on how to fix the problem, please reach out at producer@ihppod.org. You're listening to I Hate Politics. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. I'll be back with Maryland Delegate David Moon to talk about Maryland's new marijuana laws. David Moon, welcome back to I Hate Politics.
Hey, thanks for having me back.
2023 was going to be the cannabis session. The General Assembly was supposed to create a framework within which cannabis could be used in the state. What happened?
Well, last year, we really did most of the criminal justice tweaks to cannabis. And this year, we did a lot of the business and regulation tweaks. So really, the Economic Matters Committee, the Ways and Means Committee, and their Senate counterparts had the bigger role this year since they deal with taxes and business regulation. Last year, it was judiciary and judicial proceedings taking the lead on the criminal justice elements. And we continued some of that this year, but in truth, this was really the year about how we handle licensing, sales, and taxes of cannabis.
Okay, let's talk about licensing, taxing, and sales of cannabis. What was passed?
So we have a system coming up that is intending to collapse our medical and recreational system into one system. Now, I say that right now we only have a medical system, and the recreational system is basically what we approved. But going forward, there's just going to be one system. There will be special hours that dispensaries are required to operate for the medical card holders, and those customers will not be subject to sales taxes on medical products, and they have to keep a inventory for the medical folks. So that will keep that program going in a different form than the recreational sales. Additionally, the medical users are going to be able to grow 4 plants as opposed to the 2 that folks in the recreational system are going to be able to do. So that's what the medical system is going to look like going forward. The recreational system, I think, is what a lot of people have been interested in. And so what's going to happen is at the onset, I expect to see most of the medical license holders convert over to this new license type. They pay a fee to do that. That's basically 10% of what they raised in sales in the last year. That's the cap on the fee. So basically, they have to hand over 10% of their haul in order to switch their license to this new type, and they actually have to do it. So if they don't, they're essentially abandoning their license. And in the same time, we're going to issue a call for new license holders to step forward. And in the first phase, these opportunities will be solely for social equity license applicants, as we have defined that in the law.
What is that definition?
This is really a question of race and ethnicity equity, and sort of trying to undo and not recreate some of the harms from the war on drugs and then flip around and then say, oh, well, now we're doing this legal system, but no one who was harmed from the former war on drugs problems gets to step up and be a part of this new licensing system. That's what we're trying to avoid here. So a social equity applicant under the new Maryland law, that is defined as one or more individuals who have 65% control of this company. So it's got to be a supermajority of the company has either lived in a disproportionately harmed area for at least 5 of the last 10 years, 2, attended a public school in a disproportionately harmed area for at least 5 years, or 3, for at least 2 years, you attended a 4-year higher ed institution where at least 40% of the individuals who attended were eligible for a Pell Grant. So that's the criteria in the bill. And essentially, it's attempting to create various ways for someone to step forward as someone who may have been harmed. It's not a perfect system, but these are sort of indirect ways to try and get at it.
What is a disproportionately harmed area?
That is a key question here. So this is a neighborhood that's essentially been targeted for law enforcement during this whole war on drugs period. So it is a area that is identified as having over 150% of the state's 10-year average for cannabis possession charges.
One of the criticisms of the medical system in Maryland was that it did not take into account the social equity applicancy that you have just described. But you're turning over and forcing every medical marijuana licensee to get into the recreational business. And therefore, you are taking some of the difficulties that were with the licensing system on the medical marijuana side into the new system, whether you collapse or whatever you call it. So I understand that you want here on after to do the social equity applicant, but are you not just importing also the problem that has pre-existed?
Well, look, there's several ways to answer that. First, yes, of course, if you have a flawed system and it's a subset of the new system, then of course you are. But we're obviously diluting it because that's going to be now just a fraction of the overall licensees. And I assume that the number of licenses is going to keep growing in the code over time. So that's going to be a diminishing effect. Now, if they have first mover advantage, which they will, we obviously have to be careful about that. But, the pushback was also that we had a number of businesses that we induced to set up in the state and invest quite a large amount of money trying to get operations in the hopes that one day we would get to this point. So to try and mitigate that, the bill also does quite a number of things that didn't happen under the medical system. For one, we are linking up smaller equity applicants with these existing license holders to try and forge partnerships. And that's actually codified in the law.
How are you doing that?
There's going to be a grant program. There's an incubator. There's all sorts of programs that are really designed to ensure the success of this. There is also a requirement that these license application opportunities have to be actively marketed and distributed into these communities in advance of this system. And again, the non-equity applicants for the new licenses are held back until later phases of operation. There's also grant funds that are going to be generated out of the conversion fees that the medical license holders pay. Look, I can't promise that if we look back in 10 years, we're going to see that we magically solved this problem. But I can tell you that everybody has put a good faith effort into trying to do it and to put lots of checks and stops in here. And there's also actually a whole office being created, an office of social equity within this new alcohol, tobacco, cannabis commission that's proactively going to be monitoring for this and trying to mitigate where there are problems.
What, in your view, are some first mover advantages those big players likely to have?
Some of them are horizontally and vertically integrated. And for those who know what that means, you might have we have grower licenses, we have processor licenses, we have dispensary licenses, we're going to have delivery licenses and things like this. And so if a business owns its growing operations, it also owns the processing for vape juice and edibles and things like that, and it owns the sales, well, then they're going to have a huge advantage in terms of just access to supply and the ability to promote their own product line on their shelves versus a competitor's product line.
You could get a social equity applicant get a license, and then can they just turn around and sell it to an out-of-state company?
Not immediately. The license holders have to wait 5 years before they can transfer it. But I fully expect that at year 5, you're going to see people doing that. It's an interesting thing. Like, one thing I'll point out, the chair of Economic Matters, C.T. Wilson, was very explicit that he had a goal of Black wealth generation in this process, that it wasn't, equity was not a broadly defined term for him, that he thought that Black and brown people specifically had been harmed by Maryland law enforcement activities and wanted to ensure that that would happen. Other states try to do something, say, for Black farmers that had been discriminated against in the past, and so issued licenses on that purpose. Those families immediately flipped the license for cash. And you know what? That's entirely their right.
You say you're collapsing the recreational and medicinal systems. Is there any difference between the products in the two systems?
No, I think the product is going to be the same, I would expect, substantially, since the dispensaries are going to be operating as both medical and recreational. My expectation is that for the patient or customer, whichever the case may be, it's really going to be a difference in their sales tax. The dispensaries, though, are required to maintain a medical inventory.
If there's no difference in the quality of the product, why are you requiring separate inventory?
Not separate inventory. They have to guarantee that they have inventory on the medical side. The medical patients take a priority to the recreational patients under our system.
Yeah, I mean, why would any dispensary even do that?
It would be an artifact if they did it. But again, this is just to ensure people that the medical side is not a fiction. That system continues in this new world.
So I read that there were some presentations by different folks to the legislative work group on marijuana, and the estimate that I saw was that the demand is expected to be 1.8 million pounds in all kinds of versions. About 25% of it would be in cannabis tourism, which means about 2.5 million plants need to be grown in Maryland. Are we ready for that?
We'll see. The legislature upped the growing capacity in Maryland this year. That's all in law. We had actually quite a lot of debate about whether we should be doing that. Oh my God, are we flooding the market? I don't know, but again, and it's many times. I think we're going several times over what's currently existing in the medical market. But I don't know quite what's going to happen here. But we will be not alone in the region in being open for business, but kind of. I mean, DC has a little bit of a gray area open for business sign for cannabis sales, but it's not really all above board over there. So Maryland will be, I guess, in this immediate region, the beneficiary of that.
Is it your expectation, is it the legislature's expectation that you've created a system that will significantly reduce the black market in marijuana going forward. I mean, there is concern about what the rate of taxation ought to be, right? With respect to how much revenue you generate versus how much of the black market you wipe out.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think our hope is that we're going to put a dent in the black market, and there's a hope that delivery is going to be the way we really chip into it. Again, this is I've been very aware of the relationship between convenience and criminality that we're creating here. That if there are, let's say, 4 dispensaries, on the Eastern Shore, I mean, where are they going to be? Ocean City, Salisbury, Cambridge, like I'm trying to think. You're not going to put them in sort of the more rural bits of that area. Probably they're all going to be by Ocean City, again, unless you're forcing a true geographic distribution. And so my expectation is fully that we're going to have lots of black market sales going on, for some gray market sales, I would actually call them, once it's legal, going on for a long time. I've warned people about this, that you'll have people who work in Montgomery County. They might go and pick up from the dispensary down here, and then as a side hustle, go back to Garrett County, where there are a few dispensaries, and sell that product back over there. And when they
Isn't that interesting? Because Garrett is probably going to grow a lot of the marijuana. It's an interesting proposition because you're going to have the growing in certain areas of the state, whether it's Eastern Shore or Western Maryland, but the market is in Montgomery and Prince George's and in Howard, that are fairly rich, have wealthy folks that spend a lot of money on this, right? So it is interesting to see if your argument that people will actually be gray marketing it back to where it was produced, and you're going to get some feedback, sort of pushback on that, right?
Yeah, I think that's possible. But look, here's a big difference. Like, we'll eventually fix this. We have a Frito-Lay factory in Harford County, and it's sort of the same thing. That stuff is manufactured over there, pumps out throughout the state, and it's coming out to Montgomery County. But the difference is the retail distribution points exist everywhere in Harford and in Montgomery. I do think we'll eventually get there, but we have to assume that in that lag time, there's going to be gray market sales. There's going to be additional, and that continues to remain a criminal offense in Maryland.
Tell me about what the requirement is specifically with the geographical distribution of dispensaries. What is that?
That's done at that's I think that's going to be done at the administrative level. That it's sort of the charge of the commission on how to do that. They did it under the original medical system using legislative districts. I'm not satisfied that that's a useful endeavor.
And do you have any suggestions as to how to do it right?
You could be very prescriptive about where these dispensaries have to be located, like you could make a proximity to the next dispensary one of the parameters. But again, I don't know. I think this is going to be shaking out over time, and part of it will be, I guess we'll see where.
But if a pre-existing dispensary has the right to push basically another dispensary away, you're essentially also according monopoly rights. Well,
that's right. This is going to be difficult. It's going to be difficult.
Okay.
But again, but we have very specific policy goals with this that we don't with, say, the distribution of potato chips, right? Like, if those potato chips don't make it around in Harford County, but Montgomery, okay. That's an interesting business problem for Frito-Lay. But for us here, we're talking about that gap in access leading to criminality. I think that's problematic. So, so we do want it. We have more incentive to fix it.
In Maryland, the price is almost $14 an ounce. Um, and where is a price point in your view that has the best balance between revenue generation and wiping out the black market?
I mean, honestly, then it's the lowest price point. I mean, it's very simple, and if that's your goal, that's very simple. It's the lowest price point at the most convenient access point.
Yeah. So Oregon sells for $7 an ounce. The price in this area, according to the websites I looked at, was $14 an ounce.
This is a dynamic that's going to shake out over time, and the medical license holders all have lobbyists and what have you. So we're going to be fighting this. But I've said they've traditionally wanted fewer licenses out there for obvious reasons.
Right.
But I said no. If our goal is to reduce the black market, then we want a greater number of licenses. But different people have different goals, and it's not a binary choice here. So it's going to be juggling multiple goals at one time.
Well, so I think the part of the balancing factor is that people also want to raise revenue from this.
Yeah,
operation.
I mean that part, it's becoming more and more questionable. I mean, there's a large cost to standing up the program and getting the government agencies in line to do this, and that's going to be true for some time. I don't know what the other hidden social costs are that the government's going to absorb from this change. So we'll see. And when you look at the structure of what we're doing here, we're trying to keep taxes low at the onset. The regular 6% to start. I don't think we're thinking we're going to be swimming in billions of dollars, and a lot of it we're pumping back into the system itself. So we'll see.
All right, let's talk about these social costs a little bit because they are important, right? And that'll get us to the idea of criminal justice things that you have personally been working on. So you said last year you passed some bills around this. What were they?
Well, last year was one big bill. It removed criminal penalties on personal use, possession of plants and small amounts, but it maintained criminal penalties on people who are continuing to vend cannabis without a license. So that remains. And if you're doing it in a large amount, we still have mandatory minimum prison sentences. You think about alcohol or tobacco; these are illegal substances, but there's not a crime against possessing too much of a legal substance, and there's not a crime for someone in the business of selling those things selling you too much. You can't get jailed for buying too much beer. But that's not the system we have in Maryland with cannabis yet. So, like I said, if you just take the differences and line them all up, we're in a very different place. I pointed this out continuously. Here's another example. When the alcohol tobacco folks came in and they're absorbing cannabis in, we were talking about this and they said, "Oh, I think we can handle all this with the existing medical commission." I said, "Well, how do you know that? You don't know how many licenses they're going to be." And they were assuming a low number of licenses. I was like, "How many alcohol licenses are there?" I said, "Thousands." And so if you just imagine the scale up over time, we're going to go from a system that has 300 licenses. I assume we're eventually going to be where alcohol and tobacco are, and we're going to be into the thousands. And so this is a very long runway of change, I suspect, again, in the meantime, with a lot of criminality and debate at the edges of these numbers.
So what other bills did you pass on the criminal justice side this year?
Oh, there's a huge debate left over from last year about whether police should be able to search your car on the basis of an odor. We finally rammed through a bill at the last second that says they can't. That can't be the sole basis for a stop or search. Obviously, driving while intoxicated or smoking while you're in the car, all that stuff is still illegal. But as to the odor being the sole reason, that's out.
Okay.
Can't do it.
Okay. What about odor or DUI at an employment? How do you deal with that?
We have not. The employer can still restrict as they want, and the same things with housing. But the bill does have contemplation of smoking. I forget what the term. A lounge, a public consumption space. So you sort of get around this issue about renters and people living in places with lease restrictions on cannabis use, and the problem of people smoking in their cars when we don't want them to. So that's in the bill, contemplated as something we will see.
So, but what happens if somebody, say, ingests marijuana over the weekend, then goes to work on Monday and is, perfectly okay to function, but the employer then does some kind of testing?
They need to know their own employer's rules.
Do you think that the state legislature needs to weigh in on this at some point?
Yep.
How?
I mean, you can certainly make it. Again, under the old system with the medical card holders, you had a very good reason to say, well, you shouldn't harm someone's employment if it's not related, if there's no nexus between, like if you're a commercial trucker, okay, you could make a case there. But if there's not a nexus there, it's an interesting question for a medical card holder, whether their employment should be able to be harmed. In that scenario, I would cleanly say if there's no performance issue, no. Now, when you step into the recreational world, I don't know. It's an interesting question. Can your boss tell you they don't want you drinking on the weekends if you're coming into work on Monday? If there's no, again, if the alcohol effect is not with you on Monday, and I'm not talking about someone who's getting wasted Sunday night rolling into work on Monday morning, but does what you did on Saturday with alcohol or tobacco have any relevance to what you do at work on Monday? Again, it's interesting. Cannabis stays in your system and tests for a long time. The levels don't correlate to your impairment. These are novel questions, but from the outset, we're obviously not going to ban an employer's ability to make their own decisions on this. And I think there'll be evolving norms on this over time.
Have other states sorted this out?
I don't know. I can't think of a state that's restricted employers on this basis, but I actually haven't researched this in any detail.
Okay. So in terms of, so police can't now stop for smell of marijuana. Is that correct? Is that what you said?
They cannot search the non-accessible parts of your vehicle. I believe that's how it works. But they can.
What does that mean, even? I mean, they can't search the trunk.
Yeah.
But they can search the cab itself.
Last year, there was a 4-3 Court of Appeals decision that says the smell of marijuana does provide police with reasonable suspicion that you have more than 10 grams.
And so now with the new law, how does it work?
So with traffic stops, it can't be the sole basis. They need something else. I can see a large amount, here, or there's some other indicia of criminality other than cash, but it's a pretty, what popped out. I mean, there was a huge debate about this because people were worried about driving, and things of that nature. But what popped out at the final, and it was literally one of the last bills that passed in the last 15 minutes of the legislation, was a pretty hard no on police doing odor searches for traffic stops.
Well, maybe explain odor searches. I mean, so the police would have to smell marijuana from a moving car in order for them to justify or not justify a search. Is that what we are trying to avoid? That they usually smell marijuana from a moving car and then they act upon that smell from that moving car to stop. Or, I mean, I would imagine that it is a stopped car where there is smell of marijuana, and then they, I'm unclear as to what it means.
Yeah, if you have the smell of marijuana wafting out of a moving vehicle, you likely have evidence of a DUI offense. If someone is driving and they get pulled over because they have a taillight out or something like that, and the officer smells marijuana, in that instance, I don't think with the law that passed at the moment, a search would be justified.
Okay. So that makes it clearer. Thank you.
Yeah.
David, are you concerned about road safety as a consequence of Maryland's recreational marijuana use?
Of course.
Tell me how and what the implications are.
You don't want people driving while impaired. I mean, that's plain and simple. We have that problem now, though. I mean, marijuana use is quite high at the moment. Polysubstance use, people on medications, prescription meds, driving. This is just sort of the world we inhabit at the moment. There's a fear that one makes this worse with cannabis, but actually the early data on that has really not been conclusive. There's been this sort of allegation that there's a rise in incidence of fatal car crashes where you can test for the presence of alcohol and cannabis, but really, I think alcohol, at least in some of the early studies on this, was the consistent present factor. But I say that with a open mind to seeing the data. I believe in data on this, and so we are. Last year, we set up tracking for this sort of data and metrics, so that we have some control group from the before legalization times to look at everything and see and monitor changes over time. So again, there's no solving any of this. We'll just be in constant mitigation and evolution mode for some time.
David Moon, thank you for taking the time to explain how Maryland is going into its recreational marijuana use phase.
Thank you very much.
Would it be so hard to calibrate your lies? That would reduce the element of surprise. I wouldn't bet upon an outcome of success. Leave behind destruction, a heaping hot mess.
That is Maryland Delegate David Moon. You're listening to I Hate Politics. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. Usually at this time, I draw lessons from my conversations with my guests. But with David Moon, I am seldom left with that job. One thing to note is how much public policy is really experimental. You try out one thing and it doesn't work, so you try another. A big question that remains about marijuana in Maryland is what the right tax rate ought to be. There are several questions as well that remain about where the dispensaries will be located, where growing will occur, and will local governments allow it. DUI for cannabis is going to be a huge test ground. And how employers deal with positive tests for cannabis at work is terra incognita. One thing is certain, however. Recreational marijuana becomes legal in Maryland in July 2023. That's all for this episode. You've been listening to I Hate Politics. I am Sunil Dasgupta. Music for this episode comes from CatScan, a Washington, D.C. band of three friends who have known each other since kindergarten. Paul Chaparis on bass and vocals, Mason Shelby on keyboards and vocals, and Kevin Kingsley on guitars. Their music is available on major streaming platforms and on Bandcamp. If you want to share your music on the show or know someone else who might want to, please email us at producer@ihp.org. I hope you will subscribe and share the podcast as we bring you stories about politics close to you and to your home. See you next time.
And I can't give in to men of sin who only care to win. Every cited source is illegitimate. All these guys are so completely full of it. They're mentally unfit. But I can't believe the words that he has written down for me. And it's time that we begin to see how things are gonna